They're using unguided missiles. They're using missiles that are being supplied to them by the US. And they're using AI surveillance technology in order to identify targets at a rate that we've never seen before. And we also have to remember that Israel is developing this kind of tech for the US and for the UK for domestic use as well.
A new report citing a U.S. intelligence assessment claims that nearly half of the bombs Israel has used on the Gaza Strip over the last 10 weeks have been unguided munitions, something that the U.S. has repeatedly criticized its adversaries when it accused them of doing the same. And yet, here the U.S. is funding Israel, arming them to the teeth, supporting this, sending them unguided munitions, knowing that they pose a much higher risk to the public, and yet knowing at the same time that Israel is going to be using those bombs on one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. So why is the U.S. doing this? What is it getting out of all of this? Well, we discussed all of that and more with a special guest today, and we also got into Israel's use of artificial intelligence, how it is using the Gaza Strip as a testing ground right now, and what concerns that could present in the future for other areas of the world, specifically in the West, as the horrific atrocities that our government is funding right now has the ability and the power to come right back home. Let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is independent journalist Vanessa Beeley, who has worked extensively in the Middle East, and she joins us from Damascus. Vanessa, thanks so much for taking the time to talk today.
Rachel, thanks for inviting me on. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you. I wanted to talk to you especially about this recent story that was actually published by CNN, in which they say that there is a new U.S. intelligence assessment that shows that nearly half of the 29,000 air-to-ground munitions Israel has targeted the Gaza Strip with over the last 10 weeks have been unguided or dumb bombs, which obviously pose a significantly higher risk to the civilian population, especially in such a highly populated area. What do you make of this assessment?
Well, what I see going on at the moment, particularly in the US, is an awful lot of doublespeak and smoke and mirrors, and trying to distract from the fact that this Palestinian genocide is effectively a US-Israel UK project. The US is not divorced from what Israel is the atrocities that Israel is committing against Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. It's fully involved in it. It's fully invested in it. It's supplying the weapons, the bombs. And, isn't it ridiculous to call a bomb a dumb bomb? I mean, it's just disgusting for me. It's a bomb. What this actually means, of course, if you're going to analyze it, is that the claims by Israel and even by the US that this is targeted bombing of Hamas militia and militants and leadership, it's nonsense, because if they're using unguided missiles, then they are potentially carrying out, massacres with every bomb. And it's not only this. I mean, the military industrial complex is using Gaza as a showcase for weapons. Also, I mean, we're hearing reports from doctors on the ground of wounds that they've never seen before from missiles that have been used by the IOF. They're seeing flesh literally being stripped away from the bones by the shrapnel. I mean, they're using Hellfire missiles, which should be used against tanks and heavy armory. And so basically, when they explode above the ground, it's like they're showering guillotines into the area that are just slicing limbs of Palestinians. And who benefits from this? Of course, it's the military-industrial complex, because they're literally showcasing weapons. They're experimenting on Palestinians who can go nowhere. The concentration camp is forever shrinking, because Israel is pushing them from the north into the center and then into the south. And now they're bombing the south. I spoke to a friend this afternoon in Khan Yunis, and every 5 minutes he was sending me recordings of shelling, of drone strikes, of machine gun fire, of tank shelling, of airstrikes in Khan Yunis, which is meant to be one of the safe areas, and he's in an UNRWA camp, and they're firing on and around the camp. So, for me, this is just all about it's a kind of distraction technique to get us to focus on, what bombs are they using? Does it really matter? When we have now, what is it, over 20,000 dead, how many of those children? Probably 70% women and children, deliberately targeted. And testimony now of them executing babies, executing pregnant women in the hospitals that they've taken control of in the north and in the center of Gaza.
Yeah, and it just reminds me, as you're pointing out there, it's not as if Israel is just creating these bombs on its own and then using them on the Gaza Strip. They're getting them from their Western allies, mainly the United States. So the US is knowingly sending Israel these unguided munitions that they know are going to be used on one of the most heavily populated areas on Earth, where half of the people there are children. And they are doing this. I would argue that this is being done with intent because they are knowing exactly how these bombs are going to be used. So what is the message that the US and the UK and their allies are sending to the world when they talk about this international rules-based order that we all need to be following, yet they carry out war crimes like this and they continue to give Israel the green light to say, okay, bomb however many children you want to?
Well, I mean, basically, we're back to the rules-based order, aren't we? But whose rules? The US and the UK and certain EU member states. It's their rules. And we're entering really right now, we've been heading towards it for some time, but we're entering a complete state of lawlessness globally because the US is flouting every single international and humanitarian human rights law and convention, as is Israel. The thing is, I don't divorce Israel from the US or from the UK. Britain created the Zionist settler colonialist project, and the US basically picked up the control of the project. And from, when Robert Kennedy described it, not as a populist, but he described it as a bulwark for the US in the Middle East, providing surveillance and interference and protection of their assets and prevention of the rise of BRICS, prevention of the rise of Iranian expansionism. It's very clear. Israel is a US policy tool. And if you look at, for example, the map of Greater Israel, which would include Egypt up to the Nile, of course, from the Euphrates to the Nile, 70% of Syria, 50% of Iraq, a huge chunk of Saudi Arabia. Whose plan is this? This is the US plan, right? The Israel is enacting it. Hence, the escalation against Hezbollah, the claim that they want to push Hezbollah to the north of the Litani River in Lebanon, and they're invoking UN Resolution 1701, which came into effect after the 2006 defeat of Israel by Hezbollah. But Israel, at the same time, is violating Resolution 1701 all the time because it's violating Lebanese and Syrian airspace. It's attacking Syria on a weekly, if not twice weekly basis. We had another attack about 2 days ago. They've murdered 2 Iranian Revolution Guard commanders here in Syria about a week ago. So Israel is completely violating all international norms everywhere, but at the behest of the US.
Yeah, we are certainly seeing that play out in real time. And it's been notable to watch the sort of back and forth that has come up here lately, because initially the US said, we stand with Israel, we support Israel. But now you're seeing Biden and Blinken and Jake Sullivan recently making these statements in which they've been a little bit more critical of Israel. I know that Biden specifically admitted that Israel is indiscriminately bombing the Gaza Strip, but then almost in the same breath, he says, but we'll continue to support them. What is the message sent when you have these US officials who, they can sit there and they can say essentially that Israel is carrying out war crimes all they want to, but yet they're still saying we will continue to be complicit in those crimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're seeing is almost like a good cop, bad cop routine, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it would be comedic if it wasn't so tragic for the Palestinian people. But, if they were genuine in their intention in trying to prevent Israel basically genociding all of what remains of Palestine that hasn't already been ethnically cleansed from 1917 onwards. People forget this. This is more than 100 years of ethnic cleansing. Then why would it veto peace multiple times? It's in the actions. That's the thing. The words mean nothing when the actions defy what the words mean. So in other words, they're still supplying weapons. We have Samantha Power arriving in El Arish in a military jet and claiming that there's tons of humanitarian relief, but we don't see any images of the humanitarian relief. We know that no humanitarian relief is entering. Again, I was speaking to someone today, and he said to me, there's nothing getting in. We've got nothing. Kids are literally squeezing the rainwater out of their wet clothes to drink it. That's how desperate the situation is there, And none of them know at any moment when they can be bombed or sniped or shelled or droned. The drones, every single film or video that you watch from Gaza, you will hear this sound. And when I was there in 2012, it drives you crazy. It's another form also of psychological warfare because it's constant. You never escape it. It's like having 1,000 lawnmowers in the sky above your head. And at any moment, any one of those drones can just pick you off. It just depends how the guy feels in the control room back in the occupied territories. And also, we shouldn't forget that the 972 MAG investigation into the fact that AI is now identifying targets at a rate way beyond any other genocidal conflict that has been waged against the Palestinians inside Gaza, right? So when you combine that with the fact that they're using unguided missiles, they're using missiles that are being supplied to them by the US, and they're using AI surveillance technology in order to identify targets at a rate that we've never seen before. And we also have to remember that Israel is developing this kind of tech for the US and for the UK for domestic use as well. Units like 8200, which are some of the top spy espionage units within the occupied territories, are working directly with AI and surveillance companies in the UK, definitely, and I'm sure in the US. So what's happening is, sorry, the electricity just went off, is, whatever we're seeing now in Palestine is being developed for use elsewhere also. We also have to remember this.
Wow, that's a really interesting point, and that's something that I haven't heard brought up before, when you're talking about the Gaza Strip really being used as this testing ground. And yeah, a lot of people, they may look at that and they may say, oh, I feel so sorry for the Palestinian people, but they're not thinking about the long game of that technology possibly being used on them and their families in years to come as it is started out there. And we've obviously seen that, I know, when it comes to the US and the weapons that it used. It has carried out a number of experiments over the years, both on its own people and on foreign people. And so this is how it starts out. But yet people don't really, I think that they look at that and they say, oh, well, that was what happened, during World War II, or that was something in the past. This is present day. And not only are we seeing it playing out, but we're seeing it play out on social media with live images and videos, and we're getting to see it. Do you think that that's something that the West, and Israel included, that they're taking into account the fact that you have the international pressure now, the international community that is looking at this and that is saying, this is wrong, this needs to be stopped?
Well, I think you saw a demonstration of that in the UNGA vote last week, which obviously voted overwhelmingly in favor of a ceasefire. I mean, to what extent that is actually going to be brought into effect, I don't know, and I would suspect it's highly unlikely. But yeah, you know, there have been comments coming out of Israel, not necessarily from Netanyahu's far-right extremist regime, coalition regime, but from previous advisors and so on, saying, you know, like Israel is really losing the PR war on this. But it's not only losing the PR war, of course, it's losing the ground war. It's not managing to eliminate the resistance factions, and it's losing battles inside Gaza itself, drastically so. They're losing way more officers and soldiers than they're admitting, according to, I think it was one Israeli official or one media outlet the other day. And so, but to a degree, someone asked me this the other day, and I said, but I think we've almost reached a point where they don't care. Like, where I think the agenda now is set, and that basically, you know, because nobody has really stepped up to stop them, the UN Security Council is a completely, you know, it's a hollowed out shell of what it should be, because it's totally under control of the veto system, which of course, you know, has been used against the US to some extent by Russia and China, particularly in Syria, of course. But effectively, the dominant force within the UN Security Council are the French, US, and UK Permanent Security Council members, who simply push through their policies and their agendas and their rules by using the veto or not, whatever the case may be. So I think, yes, from on a public consensus level, you know, the world has the kind of the veil has been lifted for a lot of people. But to what extent they're actually going to be able or be empowered to stop what is coming, I'm really not sure. That's the problem.
Yeah, it has been frustrating watching the UN Security Council meetings, and you have a country that says, hey, let's bring up a resolution calling for just a humanitarian ceasefire. And then you have the US comes in and it says, oh, well, it doesn't condemn Hamas. It doesn't say that Israel can defend itself. And they focus on the language when it's literally just a resolution calling for a ceasefire. That's it. That should not be something that requires a lot of debate. And yet the US has made it that way for its close ally. So you have the other countries in the region that are looking at Israel, knowing that it has this vision for a greater Israel, which would involve taking their land. Do you see the concern there as they're watching Israel now try to take full control over both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, thinking, well, if Israel gets its way here, then it could be targeting other areas in the region next as it tries to fulfill that vision?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, everyone here in Syria and in Lebanon, particularly among Hezbollah, are perfectly well aware of what the project entails. And that is to a large degree why, of course, Hezbollah has been trying to contain the confrontation in southern Lebanon and in the northern occupied territories, and to not allow it to escalate to a dangerous level. I mean, you know, Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, have been coming out with incredible statements. Netanyahu said, you know, if Hezbollah doesn't end the confrontation, then Lebanon and Beirut will be turned into Khan Yunis. I mean, that's just extraordinary that this kind. Can you imagine if President Putin or President Assad came out with a statement, or President Raisi in Iran came out with such a statement? You know, if Israel doesn't stop, then Tel Aviv is going to be turned into Khan Yunis. It would be the end of the world. I mean, you know, the US would be mobilized immediately. It would just, everyone would go crazy. But Israel can say this kind of thing on an almost daily basis. And so what you're seeing now, and I see a lot of people kind of complaining and saying, you know, Arab states are doing nothing, they're not helping. But a lot of that is also down to the Palestinian resistance, who have said quite clearly it's our fight. If we reach a point where we need intervention, we will let you know. And so all of those states respect that. However, Hezbollah is occupying Israeli troops in the northern occupied territories. So in other words, preventing them being redeployed to Gaza or to West Bank. Syria is opening up its territory for Palestinian resistance factions and for the Islamic resistance to actually use Syrian territory to launch missiles at, for example, the occupied Golan territories and the Israeli settlers there. And of course, what happens is then that Syria gets bombed for its pains for allowing that to happen. And people need to remember that Syria is occupied on three sides. You know, it has US occupation northeast, southeast. It has Israel in the south. It has Turkey in the north and in the northwest. It has Al Qaeda in the northwest. It has ISIS at the US military base in Al Tanf that is constantly running incursions against Syrian Arab army positions, particularly in central Syria, which, funnily enough, is where some of the hydrocarbon centers are and natural gas resources also. So I'm sure that's only coincidental. And Iraq is in a similar position. So the Islamic resistance is operating from within Iraq and is targeting the US military bases in Iraq and Syria. So I think what's happening is that what I call the resistance axis countries, I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia and UAE and Jordan that I consider to be vassal states of you know, the Western entities and even of the Zionist regime. I'm talking of the resistance axis states. They're trying to manage the conflict as well as possible and to offer as much support to the Palestinian resistance. And that does with the supply of weapons and so on, which Syria has been doing throughout the 12 years of war against Syria itself.
Yeah, certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I appreciate you taking us through some of the latest and giving insight into what is going on in this region that is really so poorly covered in the West and intentionally so. Independent journalist Vanessa Beeley, thank you so much for your time and insight today.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for having me on.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my Substack. That's at rachelblevins.com. If you want to support my work, check out my page on Buy Me a Coffee. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid member, or you can also submit a one-time donation. Thank y'all so much for your support. I appreciate it more than you know, and I'll see you next time.